The clock tower loomed over the small town like a sentinel, its weathered stone exterior streaked with decades of grime, and the iron hands creaked with each passing second. The people of Belwick called it a monument, a piece of history. To the teens gathered in the square that night, it was just a backdrop, a silent observer to their Halloween revelry. Derek leaned against a statue at the square's center, his breath visible in the cold autumn air. His friends, Maria, Jacob, and Lena, laughed at some crude joke, their voices carrying through the stillness, but his eyes kept flicking to the clock tower. It was something about the way it seemed more imposing tonight, the way its shadow stretched unnaturally far across the cobblestones as the streetlights flickered. "Midnight soon," Lena said, checking her phone. Her nervous energy broke the rhythm of the group. She had never liked Halloween, not since she was a child, but tonight was different. There was a heaviness to the air, a tension that made her feel like something terrible was about to happen. Maria, her long scarf flapping in the wind, rolled her eyes. "Seriously, Lena? Don't tell me you believe in all those old stories. The 13th chime? It's just a myth to scare kids." Lena shrugged, but the flicker of unease in her expression was undeniable. "You've heard it, though. The clock strikes 13 on Halloween night, and then... the beast comes," Jacob finished, his voice mockingly ominous. "It's all bullshit." Derek glanced around the square. The streets had emptied unusually fast. It was Halloween, sure, but most of the adults had hurried home long before the night fully fell. Even the usual stragglers who hung out at the bars were nowhere to be seen. It felt like the town itself was holding its breath, waiting. "Doesn't feel like bullshit tonight," Derek muttered. The clock struck 12. The chime echoed through the square, deep and resonant, a sound that seemed to settle into their bones. Each toll was precise, almost painful in its clarity. 1, 2, 3. The group grew silent as the sound carried through the still air. They waited for it to stop at 12. 13. The sound wasn't just a chime, it was wrong. The note dragged out, deeper, darker, like the groan of something ancient and hungry awakening. Lena gasped, her phone slipping from her hand. Maria's mocking smile faded, replaced with a frown of disbelief. Jacob laughed nervously. "Okay, I wasn't expecting that." Before anyone could speak, the ground beneath the clock tower rumbled. Derek felt it in his chest first, a low, rhythmic pulse. He stared up at the tower, and his eyes widened as something began to shift in the shadows near the base. "What the hell?" Maria whispered, stepping back. The iron doors of the clock tower creaked open, a slow, deliberate movement, as if whatever was inside had been waiting for this exact moment. Darkness poured from the opening like a living thing, pooling at the base of the tower and creeping toward them. Then came the sound. A scraping, dragging noise like nails on stone, slow at first, but growing louder with each passing second. Derek's heart hammered in his chest. He strained to see into the darkness, but all he could make out was a shifting mass, something too large to be human, something moving with the intent of a predator stalking its prey. "We need to leave," Lena said, her voice barely a whisper, but no one moved. The figure emerged, barely more than a silhouette at first. Its form was grotesque, like a monstrous sculpture made from nightmares. Too many limbs, too many eyes. It wasn't solid. Its shape flickered, as though reality itself couldn't contain it. The beast was constantly shifting, like a reflection in a shattered mirror, trying to take form, but never quite staying still. Jacob stepped back, but his foot caught on the edge of the fountain, and he stumbled, swearing under his breath. The sound seemed to draw the creature's attention. Its head snapped toward him, and Derek caught a glimpse of something worse than any horror he'd ever imagined. Glowing eyes, not human, but something primal and full of hunger. The beast moved, its form shifting in time with the darkness. A long skeletal arm extended toward Jacob, and as it reached, its hand transformed into a mass of writhing tendrils, slithering through the air. "Jacob! Move!" Derek shouted, but it was too late. The tendrils wrapped around Jacob's leg, pulling him down to the ground. His scream tore through the night, and the others watched in horror as the creature dragged him inch by inch toward the clock tower. Its body seemed to ripple and distort with each movement, as if it were feeding off his terror, growing stronger with every second. Jacob's hands clawed at the ground, leaving bloody trails on the stone, but the creature's grip was relentless. Lena screamed, backing away, her eyes wide with terror. "Run!" Derek shouted, grabbing Maria by the arm and yanking her toward the street. They bolted, leaving Jacob behind, his screams fading into the darkness as they ran. The clock tower's shadow loomed over them, stretching impossibly far, as if it were chasing them down the empty streets. The ticking of the clock was deafening now, each second like a hammer to the skull, growing louder and faster as the beast pursued them. Derek could hear it, just behind them, the scraping, dragging sound and the wet, guttural growl that promised death. They turned a corner, ducking into an alleyway, but the beast's presence followed. Derek leaned against the wall, gasping for breath, his heart pounding in his ears. He glanced back toward the square, but the shadow of the clock tower was still there, looming, watching. "We have to hide," Maria said, her voice shaking. "It's going to kill us." Derek nodded, though his mind raced with the impossibility of what he had just seen. The town wasn't supposed to have monsters, but now, with Jacob's screams still echoing in his head, he couldn't deny the truth. The beast had been released, and the clock was ticking. The night seemed darker now, as if the sky itself had swallowed the stars. Derek leaned against the cold brick wall of the alley, trying to catch his breath. Beside him, Maria shivered, her face pale, eyes wide and unfocused. Lena crouched on the ground, hugging her knees, her breaths ragged. The distant ticking of the clock echoed in their minds, relentless and loud. "Where's Jacob?" Lena's voice trembled, her words barely above a whisper. Derek stared at the mouth of the alley, unable to answer. He had seen what the beast did, how it took Jacob without hesitation. The thing, whatever it was, had pulled him into the darkness, and the memory of Jacob's scream made Derek's skin crawl. "He's gone," Maria said flatly, her voice hollow. She shook her head, as if trying to shake the image out of her mind. "We need to go. It's going to come back." "What was that?" Lena whispered. "What is it?" Derek didn't have an answer. How could he explain the shape-shifting thing they had seen, the way it twisted in and out of the shadows, never fully taking a form they could understand? It had been too monstrous, too wrong. "I don't know," Derek finally said, his voice tight. "But we can't stay here. It's hunting us." Maria bit her lip, then nodded. "Let's get to my house. It's not far. Maybe it can't follow us there." They stood, keeping close to the walls of the alley. The ticking of the clock still echoed faintly, but now there was something else. A low, dragging sound, like metal scraping against stone. The beast wasn't far. Derek led the way, his body tense, adrenaline keeping him moving even as dread gnawed at his insides. They crept through the streets, the town now eerily silent. Storefronts that had been bright with Halloween decorations earlier that evening stood dark, their windows reflecting only shadows. It felt as if they were the last people alive in Belwick, as if the town had been swallowed by something ancient and malevolent. As they crossed the street, Lena gasped and froze. Her eyes widened in terror, and she pointed toward the far end of the square. "There," she whispered. Derek followed her gaze and saw it. Just a shadow at first, but then the thing began to take shape, shifting and distorting as it moved closer. The beast was no longer the grotesque form it had taken when it dragged Jacob away. Now it was taller, more fluid, its body twisting into something lean and humanoid, but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its fingers stretched into talons, and its head, God, its head, was a mass of writhing tendrils, eyes glowing faintly within the mess of shadowy appendages. "It's changing," Maria whispered, her voice quivering with fear. "It's changing again." Derek's pulse quickened. He understood now. It wasn't just a beast, it was something worse. Something that fed on them, on their fears. The thing had twisted itself into what Jacob feared most, and now it was changing again, searching for the next weakness to exploit. "We need to run," Derek said, gripping Maria's arm. But as they turned to flee, Lena's feet stayed planted, her face contorted in terror. She was frozen, staring at the thing as it crept closer, its shifting mass stretching and bending like liquid. "Lena, move," Derek hissed, pulling at her arm, but she wouldn't budge. "I can't," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I can't. It's in my head. It's everywhere." Maria looked back at Lena, panic flaring in her eyes. What's she talking about? But Derek understood. He had seen it too. The beast didn't just hunt them physically, it was in their minds, warping their perception, turning the world into something unrecognizable. Lena's fear wasn't just of the monster. She had always been terrified of being alone, of being abandoned. And now the creature had twisted that fear into something tangible. The alley around them seemed to stretch, the walls closing in. The lights of the street lamp flickered, casting shadows that didn't make sense, shadows that didn't match the objects they belonged to. Lena gasped again, her breath hitching in her throat, her eyes wide and glassy. "I can't see you," she whimpered. "You're gone. I'm all alone. Derek grabbed her face, forcing her to look at him. "Lena, we're right here. It's in your head. Fight it." But she didn't see him. The beast had twisted her reality, warping the world around her until she was lost in her own mind. She let out a high-pitched, desperate scream, and the creature pounced. It moved with an unnatural speed, its form flickering like a strobe light, each shift more monstrous than the last. The tendrils that made up its head shot out, wrapping around Lena's legs, pulling her down just like it had with Jacob. Her screams were cut off, strangled by her own terror as the beast dragged her toward the darkened street. Derek lunged forward, trying to grab her, but his hands passed through the air as if the space between them had stretched impossibly far. The beast was playing with them, distorting time and space as it feasted on their terror. "Lena!" Maria screamed, tears streaking her face, but it was no use. Lena's body disappeared into the darkness, her final cry lingering in the air like a haunting echo. The street was silent again, save for the relentless ticking of the clock. Derek stood frozen, his mind reeling from what had just happened. "This can't be real," he muttered, backing away. "This isn't possible." Maria gripped his arm tightly, her nails digging into his skin. "It's real. We have to get out of here, Derek. We have to hide." But Derek knew hiding wouldn't save them. The beast was inside their minds now, twisting reality, playing with their deepest fears like a cat with a mouse. And as the clock ticked down, he realized something else. It was getting stronger. The air around them felt heavier, the shadows thicker. Derek turned his gaze to the clock tower in the distance, its dark silhouette looming over the town like a warning. The beast wasn't just hunting them, it was feeding on them. The ticking of the clock echoed through the empty streets, each sound reverberating in Derek's skull like a countdown to their inevitable end. He and Maria had taken shelter inside an abandoned bookstore, the walls lined with dusty shelves and forgotten stories. The darkness outside pressed against the windows, and every creak of the old building felt like the beast's claws scraping closer. Derek sat on the floor, his back against the door they'd barricaded. His breath came in short, ragged bursts, and he struggled to calm the terror gnawing at his insides. He could still hear Lena's screams, still feel the grip of helplessness as she was dragged away into the night. Maria sat beside him, her knees pulled to her chest, her body shaking. "It's not going to stop," she whispered, her voice trembling. "We're next. You know that, right?" Derek couldn't deny it. The beast was relentless, twisting itself into their worst nightmares, feeding on their fear, growing stronger with each kill. It had consumed Jacob's fear of drowning, Lena's fear of abandonment, and now it was circling them, waiting for the next taste. "How does it know?" Maria asked, almost to herself. "How does it know what we're afraid of?" Derek didn't answer right away. His eyes were locked on the windows, scanning the shifting shadows outside, looking for any sign of the creature's return. The darkness felt alive, moving with an unnatural fluidity. But for now, the beast had yet to reveal itself again. "I think it feels it," Derek said finally. "It's in our heads. Like with Lena. She couldn't even see us at the end. The thing made her believe she was all alone." Maria's eyes darted nervously to the windows, her breath hitching. "What about us? What's it going to turn into this time?" Derek swallowed hard, but his mouth was dry. He could already feel it, the creeping sensation of something familiar yet terrifying stirring in his gut. His fears had always been there, buried beneath layers of bravado, but the beast was pulling them to the surface. "I don't know," he lied. In truth, Derek had always feared one thing above all else: being trapped in an endless cycle, a loop where he had no control, where everything repeated and nothing changed. He had seen his parents' lives follow that pattern, stuck in dead-end jobs, dead-end routines, as though they were cogs in a machine they could never escape. And now, here he was, trapped by a monster that could manipulate time and reality itself. Maria wasn't so lucky in hiding her fear. She stood suddenly, pacing the narrow aisle between the shelves, her hands running through her hair in a frantic gesture. I hate spiders. I hate them, Derek. I can't deal with that again. Derek's stomach dropped. He had almost forgotten the incident when they were younger, when Maria had been trapped in a cellar filled with spiders for hours before anyone found her. She had never been the same after that. Stop thinking about it, Derek urged, standing as well. If you think about it, it'll... A loud thud echoed through the bookstore, cutting him off. Both of them froze. The sound wasn't outside. It was in the building, like something heavy had just dropped to the floor. Maria's breathing grew erratic as her eyes darted around the room. It's here, she whispered. Before Derek could react, the sound of skittering, hundreds of tiny legs crawling over wood, filled the air. It came from above, from the ceiling, from the walls. Derek's heart pounded in his chest as the sound grew louder, more insistent, like a swarm descending on them. Maria let out a low whimper, backing toward the far corner of the room. Get it off me, she whispered, her voice rising in panic. I can feel them. They're everywhere. Derek saw them before she did. Crawling from the cracks in the ceiling, from the spaces between the shelves. Thousands of spiders, black and shiny, their legs tapping against the wooden floor in unison. They swarmed toward Maria, their numbers growing as they spilled from every corner of the room. Maria screamed, batting at her arms as if the spiders were already crawling over her skin. Derek rushed toward her, grabbing her arms, shaking her. They're not real, he shouted. Maria, they're not real! But her eyes were wide with terror, her breath shallow and panicked. She couldn't see him anymore. She was trapped in her own nightmare, just like Lena had been. The spiders were all she could see, all she could feel, and the more terrified she became, the larger they grew. Derek glanced back toward the windows, and there it was, the beast. Its form had changed again. Now an enormous spider-like creature with long, segmented legs and a body covered in glistening, bulbous sacs. It watched them with its glowing eyes, moving slowly, as if savoring the fear radiating from Maria. Maria, snap out of it, Derek shouted, shaking her harder. But she was gone. Her mind was too far gone. The beast moved in, its legs clicking against the floor, and Maria collapsed, curling into a ball as she screamed. Derek tried to pull her away, but she was limp, unresponsive. The creature's tendrils wrapped around her, pulling her toward its twisted, pulsating body. Derek stumbled back, his heart racing, helpless as the thing enveloped her, the last of her screams muffled by the swarm of nightmare spiders. It was over in moments. Maria was gone. Derek stood in the silence, staring at the spot where she had been. His chest tightened, his breath shaky, but there was no time to mourn. The ticking of the clock was louder now, impossibly loud, as if it were inside his head, pounding against his skull. He was the last one left. The shadows shifted again, and the beast's form began to change once more. This time it was slower, more deliberate, as though it was savoring its final meal. The shape twisted, growing taller, darker, until it resembled something far more abstract than any previous form. It was no longer a creature made of nightmares. It was a force. An unstoppable, ever-present force that Derek had feared all his life. It had become time itself. The walls of the bookstore began to blur, the shelves bending inward, the floor stretching into an endless loop. The ticking of the clock echoed all around him, faster now, like a drumbeat to his doom. Derek stumbled backward, watching as the world warped and twisted, trapping him in an infinite cycle of fear. No, he whispered, his voice hoarse. No, this isn't real. I'm not afraid. But his words were hollow, and the beast knew it. It loomed over him now, its form constantly shifting, a mass of distorted shapes and incomprehensible angles. The air itself seemed to pulse with the ticking of the clock, time speeding up, slowing down, bending around him like a trap. Derek tried to run, but no matter how far he went, the streets were the same. The same storefronts, the same alleyways, the same looming clock tower. He was trapped. The town had become a loop, a never-ending nightmare, and there was no escape. The clock struck again, 13, and the beast lunged. The darkness consumed him. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, the town of Belwick stirred to life. The streets were quiet, the clock tower standing tall and still in the morning light. The teens were nowhere to be found. In the center of the square, the clock ticked steadily, its hands frozen on 12. The 13th chime would not come again. Not until next Halloween.